Okay, so what did they, okay, how often did you go see your therapist, and what actually happened during the so-called therapeutic process?
I would say maybe about like once a week to once every 2 weeks. And, I would talk about, it's hard to remember so far back, but I remember
Yeah.
nothing really ever came out of the appointments. Like I would tell him like, oh, like my phone got taken away and I don't really have like any contact with the outside world, for example. And he would just be like, oh, okay, how are you dealing with that? And I'd be like, not very well. And he would just say, okay, and not really do anything about it, not really offer me anything at all. And eventually, I'd say after maybe like a month or so, he maybe got fired, or he transferred somewhere else because he wasn't there anymore. And then I got sent to another therapist. And roughly around that time, I expressed to my parents that, I'm not really satisfied. I want to go through with a medical transition. I want to go on hormones. And they actually pushed back on this at first. They were very cautious of this. They didn't know why I was pushing for it so much. And they wanted me to wait a little bit because at this point in time, I was only 13 years old. I was quite young to be doing such a thing. And they stayed that way until I got my gender dysphoria diagnosis. And during one of the appointments that they were there for, they I can't remember who exactly it was. It was either a therapist or a nurse, I think. Somebody who was involved in my transition. They told them that, like, oh, this is pretty much the only means of treating dysphoria. There was like no regards to any alternative treatments. My dad asked like about the regret rates, and they said like, oh, they didn't even, I don't think they even used the word detransition. They said like, oh, there's less than a 1% to 2% regret rate. And they also told my parents that if I wasn't allowed to go through with this, then I would be at risk of suicide.
Okay, so I want to take all of that apart, okay? Because every single one of those statements is a lie. So first of all, the American Psychological Association, in their guidelines for gender-affirming treatment, makes the case that, and because of prejudice, that there are no good long-term follow-up studies of transgender individuals. Okay, and they attribute that to prejudice against transgender individuals, which is not the reason, by the way. The reason is that there's a very low base rate, or there was, of transgender dysphoria, and the follow-up studies haven't been done in large part because the surgical and hormonal treatment regimen is relatively new. But there are no good long-term follow-up studies, and they actually complain about that. And then a couple pages later in the same document, they say that, well, it's necessary to affirm an alternate gender identity because otherwise the client or patient is at heightened risk of suicide. Okay, so first of all, both of those things can't be true. There's no way that people can know that suicide risk is elevated if gender transition is delayed unless the long-term studies are in place. And they already stated that the bloody long-term studies aren't in place. So that's all just a lie, but it's worse than that. It's way worse than that. You see, gender dysphoria is a variant of the suffering that's associated with negative emotion, depression and anxiety. Now, depression and anxiety are the primary drivers of suicidal ideation, not gender dysphoria per se. And so they're confusing the source. Now and then there is no evidence whatsoever that transition of the medical sort actually has a salutary effect on mental health, partly because the long-term studies simply haven't been done. And the idea that we actually know from a research perspective that a child is much safer if they start transition than they are if they don't. That's simply not true. Ken Zucker's work has showed quite clearly that if you just leave the kids alone, then by the time they're 18 or 19, most of them settle into their biological identities. Now, so the reason I'm stressing this is because your parents, like many parents in this situation, were put in a very, very difficult position. And I would say it's corrupt to the point of malevolence what the medical professionals are doing on this front. And that is the insistence. Well, would you rather have a live trans child or a dead child? Which is, I don't think there's anything more toxic you can say to a parent than that, because that backs them into a corner. Because their alternatives are then, well, you can let your child go ahead with this absolutely life-altering hormonal and then surgical treatment, or your child can die, and it's your fault because you don't care enough. And parents, like, they're accustomed to trusting their medical professionals, at least to some degree, and accustomed to assuming that the knowledge they put forward is valid and reliable. And the information that your family was given was none of those. In fact, it's pathological to a degree that's almost imaginable. It's criminal, in my estimation, what you were told. Because there is simply no evidence that any of that is the case. There's no evidence that transitioning kids are less likely to be suicidal. There's no evidence that that's the only treatment path that works. And there's certainly no evidence that there's no alternative to transition or suicide. It's so pathological, I can't believe it. But it's no wonder your parents were pushed into a corner, because that's a dreadful choice for a parent to have to make.
Yeah, they were definitely coerced into it. And